Hello, I'm Max Hollein, Marina Kellen French Director of the Met, and I'm delighted that you could join us virtually to celebrate the opening of The New Women Behind the Camera. This groundbreaking exhibition re-evaluates the history of photography through the lens of the new women of the 1920s, a global phenomenon that embodied an ideal of female empowerment based on real women making revolutionary changes in life and in art. 120 photographers from more than 20 countries are on view. It's a diverse group of new women for whom the camera was not only a mode of artistic expression, but also a tool for self-determination. These pioneers reflect critically on photography's capacity to shape and challenge ideas of gender and identity. Their work is a visual testament to both their personal experiences and the social and political transformations of the era. Several of the names are well known: Dorothea Lang, Berenice Abbott, and Lee Miller, while others are less familiar: Mexican photographer Lola Alvarez Bravo and Tsuneko Sasamoto, one of Japan's first women photojournalists, now 106 years old. All of the artists featured are responsible for shifting the direction of modern photography, and we are thrilled to highlight the accomplishments of such amazing practitioners. This project wouldn't have been possible without an incredible group of individuals and institutions, especially our colleagues at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, where the show was conceived and curated by Andrea Nelson, Associate Curator of Photographs. The Met's presentation was organized by curator Mia Feynman with the research assistance of Virginia McBride. I want to extend our deepest gratitude to our lenders. We wouldn't have been able to bring these captivating pictures together without their collaboration. And the result is a dynamic, timely discussion at a moment when museums like the Met are examining their own history of collecting and working to advance new and more inclusive conversations that embrace voices long underrepresented in the traditional Western canon. Many thanks are also owed to the generous donors who have enabled this exhibition to be shown at the Met, including the Horace W. Goldsmith Foundation, the Daniel and Estrelita Brodsky Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Jean Karotkin. I hope you will come to the Met to experience these works in person. Of course, it's not your only chance, as the show will travel next to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, where it will be on view starting October 31st. But without further ado, here's Mia to introduce us to the new woman behind the camera.
Hello, I'm Mia Feynman, curator in the Department of Photographs at the Met. The new woman of the 1920s was easy to recognize, but hard to define. Her hair was bobbed, her dress chic. This figure was everywhere, on the pages of magazines and on the silver screen. Embodied by celebrities like Louise Brooks or Josephine Baker, she was modern, independent, stylish, creative, and confident. The feminist ideal of the new woman emerged at the end of the 19th century and spread globally during the first half of the 20th century. Now, the figure of the new woman meant different things in different parts of the world, but what they all had in common was a desire for independence, for self-determination, and the freedom to pursue a professional life beyond that of wife and mother. This exhibition highlights the diverse new women who took up the camera and made significant advances in a number of different genres. Avant-garde experimentation and commercial studio practice. They did social documentary and photojournalism. Some of them did ethnography projects, as well as the photography of sports, dance, and fashion. Women had always participated in photography throughout the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. But it wasn't until the 1920s, after World War I, that they really entered the field in force. This was due to a variety of factors: the rise of mass communications, better access to training, and increasing acceptance of women in the workplace. For women during this period, the camera was really a means of independence and self-determination. It allowed them to create images from their own perspective, and it also allowed them to create a source of income to support themselves financially. The exhibition explores the period from the 1920s through the 1950s. This period was not only important culturally for the rise of women's rights and women's participation in public life, it was also the era of modern photography, when artistic photography and photojournalism really flourished. What makes this exhibition new and groundbreaking is that it looks at this period in a global context. The ultimate aim of the show is not merely to insert new names into the canon, but to complicate and enrich our understanding of modernity. The show offers a more inclusive version of the history of photography. It's a version that's more nuanced and hopefully will be more inspiring to future generations. As Oscar Wilde once said, the one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it. This is a self-portrait by the photographer Germaine Kroll, made around 1925. Now, most portraits show you the subject's facial features, their expression, maybe some details of their clothing and their pose. But here, the camera is foregrounded. It's a radical new way of thinking about a self-portrait. Instead of showing us what she looks like, it shows us what she does. It shows us her vocation. The picture also focuses on her hands and the lit cigarette between her fingers. Now, during this period, smoking was a symbol of liberation for women. It was considered to be a masculine and sometimes dirty and unhealthy habit, and women were not supposed to do it. So there's another way that she's depicting herself as a modern woman who is going to break through boundaries and limitations. This portrait of the Japanese photographer Tsuneko Sasimoto shows her at work, holding the camera up to her face, and she is really the embodiment of a modern new woman. We see her from a low angle in front of the sleek facade of an international-style building. She's dressed in Western clothes at a time when many women in Japan were still wearing traditional kimono. Ironically, she later said that one of the most difficult obstacles she confronted as a photographer was that she was required to wear skirts and high heels when she worked. Sasimoto began working as a freelance photographer in Tokyo after World War II and went on to become one of Japan's first female photojournalists at a time when the field was completely male-dominated. Here we see a busy street scene in a corner of Tokyo. In the background is a post exchange, or PX, which provided goods to U.S. troops and came to symbolize the American influence in Japan after World War II. We also see a young woman dressed in Western clothes, which were becoming more popular in Japan after the austerity of the war years. So it's a picture that really encapsulates what was happening in Japanese culture at the time. At 106 years old, Sasimoto is the only photographer in the exhibition who's still living today. In 1917, Lucy Schwab assumed the gender-ambiguous name Claude Cahun and began living with Marcel Moore, born Suzanne Malherbe. The couple collaborated extensively, including on a series of photographic self-portraits in which Cahun assumed various identities, using costumes, props, and makeup, much like Cindy Sherman did half a century later. This work is so radical because it suggests that gender itself is a performance, a form of masquerade, that our identities aren't fixed or stable but constructed, in part, through the images we see all around us. In this double self-portrait, we see two versions of the androgynous Cahun with two very different expressions. Neither is more real or more authentic, and that's part of the point. The self isn't one thing or another. We contain multitudes. This is a portrait of Home Vyarawala. She was one of India's first female photojournalists. Here we see her standing in the water at Chowpatty Beach in Bombay. She's wearing Western clothing and holding a camera to her eye, ignoring everything and everyone around her, completely absorbed in the act of making a picture. The image conveys a sense of professionalism, of independence, and commitment to her craft. I love this photograph of Bombay's Victoria Station. Vierawala is on the street. She positions her camera low to the ground and glimpses the station through the wheels of a rickshaw, reducing the dominance of this monumental symbol of British colonial rule, foregrounding the life of India, the life of the local street, with this backdrop of British colonialism receding into the background. Hildegard Rosenthal was one of many European Jews who emigrated to South America when the Nazis rose to power in the 1930s. She settled in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where she made some 3,000 images of the city as it transformed into a modern urban center. There's so much going on in this photograph of a busy street corner in central Sao Paulo. There are 3 businessmen in suits chatting on the right side of the frame. In the center is a fruit seller's cart that creates a wonderful frame within a frame. It seems like an all-male scene, but if you look in the center of the picture, you can see a young woman who is eating a slice of watermelon and looking back at the camera. This was actually Rosenthal's assistant. So although this scene looks completely spontaneous, it probably wasn't. It's simultaneously spontaneous and constructed. And that's what's so exciting about street photography. There's kind of a random play of people and vehicles, but what the photographer does is to frame it and to give it meaning. Commercial studio photography was an important pathway for many women to forge a professional career and to earn their own income. There was always a play of gender and race and cultural difference inside of a portrait studio, but studios run by women offered a different dynamic. Florestine Perot Collins ran a successful portrait studio in New Orleans that catered primarily to Black and Creole clients. Here we see a portrait of Collins's friend, May Fuller Keller. She is posing in a lace-tiered dress, high heels, and bobbed hair, the personification of a modern new woman. In contrast to the often racist images of Black Americans that were circulating in the mass media at the time, Keller appears relaxed, confident, and self-possessed, an individual rather than a stereotype. Creative formal approaches like photo montage, unconventional cropping, and dizzying camera angles came to define photography during this period. Although they were often overshadowed by their male partners and colleagues, women photographers were integral in shaping an avant-garde visual language that promoted new ways of seeing and experiencing the world. This is a portrait by Lucia Maholi of her husband, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who was a teacher at the famous Bauhaus art school in Germany. It's a playful portrait in which he holds up his hands as if to say, "Don't take my picture." Although it appears spontaneous, you can see that the framing is very careful. His eye is framed right between his thumb and forefinger, and the focus is on his face rather than on his hand. One of the things this portrait is about is privileging the eye, privileging the camera eye over the manual craft of painting. It's the ascendance of photography as an avant-garde art form in the 1920s. This period saw the rise of the printed press and especially of fashion magazines. The unprecedented demand for fashion and advertising photographs between the world wars provided many new employment opportunities for women. Fashion and advertising photography provided a space where women could experiment with pictures intended primarily for a female readership. This is an advertisement for hair oil by the team of Greta Stern and Ellen Auerbach, German photographers who called themselves Ringel and Pitt after their childhood nicknames. We see a very modern-looking mannequin dressed in a frumpy old nightgown that belonged to one of the artist's mothers. And if you look closely, you'll see a real human hand peeking out of the sleeve and holding the bottle of hair oil. This uncanny detail calls attention to the artifice of the advertisement, embracing but also poking fun at the commercial image of the new woman. Lillian Bassman was not only a photographer, she was also a very influential art director for the teen fashion magazine Junior Bazaar. As a photographer herself, she was very experimental. She used various darkroom techniques to give her images an almost painterly look, as in this photograph of a model wearing a translucent hat. Here, Bassman is playing with the ideas of concealing and revealing, of fashion as a means of self-expression, but also as a kind of mask to hide behind. What's great about the photographs collected here is that we're looking at images of women by women. We see more images of strength, we see more playfulness, we see different ways of conceiving of the body, of looking at the body, and of representing human bodies that have just been left out of the history of photography. Charlotte Rudolph was a pioneering photographer of dance who opened her own photography studio in 1924. This photograph is part of a series of the German avant-garde dancer Gret Paluca, who pioneered a style of dance that was angular, expressionistic, and based on improvisation. Rudolph beautifully captures the incredible energy and originality of her choreography. I love the way that her muscularity is really emphasized. Her arms and legs are bare, and she looks strong and grounded, very unlike the ethereal, more feminine style of ballet that preceded this modern dance form. Dora Kalmus, who called herself Madame Dora, was the first woman to open her own photography studio in Vienna in 1906. This full-length portrait of the painter and illustrator Mariette Pachhofer, famous for her lithographs celebrating lesbian and bisexual relationships, is an amazing representation of the new woman. Here, she cuts a very masculine image in a trench coat, a man's shirt and tie, breeches, knee-high boots, and a fedora. It's an expression in fashion of androgyny and liberation. She lived her life that way, and that is the representation that she collaborated on with Madame Dora in the studio. During this period, many women traveled extensively for the first time and took photographs that documented their experiences abroad in Africa, China, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, while others engaged in more formal ethnographic projects. When women were doing ethnographic projects, they often had access to domains that were off limits to their male counterparts and were often able to create intimate portraits that male photographers would not have been able to make. Gender may have afforded these women a special connection to certain communities, but it didn't exempt them from producing sometimes stereotypical views, especially photographers from Europe and the United States traveling to other places. And sometimes these views reinforced hierarchical concepts of race and ethnocentrism. Marjorie Contant started photographing Native American tribes of the Southwest for the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1933. This portrait of a Taos Pueblo dancer, Adam Trujillo, with his young son, is beautifully composed and shows Contant's interest in capturing her subjects as individuals and not only as ethnographic types or representatives. The 1930s was a time of global economic crisis and growing political and social unrest. Whether they were working for government agencies or independently, women contributed to the visual record of the Depression and the events leading up to World War II. From images of bread lines and worker demonstrations to forced migration and internment, women photographers helped to expose dire conditions and shaped what would become known as social documentary photography. Dorothea Lang was a renowned documentary photographer, most well known for her work with the Farm Security Administration in the 1930s. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt established the War Relocation Authority, sending some 120,000 Japanese Americans to military internment centers. Lang was employed by this agency to document its procedures, but she quickly found herself at odds with the government's actions. Here, she photographs a large sign on the facade of a grocery store owned by a Japanese-American family in Oakland, California. She wanted to make an accurate record of what was happening, including the devastating loss of homes, businesses, and community experienced by people of Japanese descent during this time. Pictures like this are painfully relevant today when Americans of Asian descent are again being attacked as a result of racism and xenophobia. The rise of the picture press in the 1920s and 30s established photojournalism as a dominant form of visual expression during this period shaped by 2 world wars. Women photographers captured a view of worldwide economic depression, struggles for decolonization in Africa, and the rise of fascism and communism in Europe and the Soviet Union. They often received the soft assignments of photographing women and children, families, and the home front, but some women risked their lives close to the front lines. Galena Sanko was a Russian photojournalist who was trained as a nurse, driver, and mechanic. She was one of the only female photojournalists sent to the front lines during World War II. What makes this such an extraordinary war photograph is that she's right there at close range, probably lying in the mud. You can almost hear the bullets, and you see these 2 soldiers sort of charging into battle. You're right there with them on the front lines in the trenches during this period of conflict. The photographers featured in The New Woman Behind the Camera produced images that reflected both their personal experiences and the extraordinary social and political transformations of the early 20th century. Together, they changed the history of photography.